If I had known the arithmetic of that basement, I never would have signed the deed. I wouldn't have even stepped out of my car for the viewing. But at the time, all I saw was a steal. I'm a freelance architect specializing in mid-century restorations. So when a 1,956 ranch-style property hit the market 40 minutes east of Salem, Oregon, listed at nearly 30% under market value, I didn't ask questions. I just wrote the check. The house was a time capsule, redwood siding, original fixtures, sitting on 3 acres of dense pine forest. It was beautiful. I closed on the house on October 14th. The first week was pure bliss. It was just me, the silence of the woods, and the smell of old timber and rain. It wasn't until the second Tuesday that I decided to tackle the basement storage. The previous owners, the estate of a Mr. Arthur Vance, had left the basement cluttered with heavy, rot-resistant cedar shelving units. I was dismantling the third unit against the north wall when my crowbar hit something that didn't sound like concrete. It rang. A deep, hollow, metallic thud that vibrated up my arm. I shoved the shelving unit aside. Behind it, painted the same dull battleship gray as the concrete walls, was a blast door. It was massive solid steel, easily 4 inches thick, with a heavy iron wheel mechanism in the center. Stamped with Atlas Safe and Vault Co. 1954. I felt a rush of genuine excitement. Finding an intact Cold War-era bomb shelter is the holy grail for property nerds like me. I grabbed a can of WD-40, soaked the hinges and the locking mechanism, and waited 10 minutes. When I finally turned the wheel, it groaned a shrieking, metal-on-metal cry that echoed through the entire house. The seal broke with a hiss of pressurized air that smelled ancient. Not like rot, but like stale electricity and dust that hadn't moved in 70 years. I clicked on my heavy-duty mag light and stepped inside. The space was larger than I expected, maybe 30 by 30 feet. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, revealing pristine concrete floors and walls lined with empty supply lockers. But it was the center of the room that made me pause. There were beds, military-style canvas cots with steel frames. They weren't stacked in bunks to save space, which would have been logical for a shelter. Instead, they were arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward toward the center of the room. I walked around the perimeter, counting them. 1, 2, 3. There were exactly 12. Each cot was fully made up. Tightly tucked wool blankets, perfectly centered white pillows. No wrinkles. No dust. It looked like a barracks ready for inspection. I remember laughing nervously, my voice sounding too loud in the confined space. "Okay, Arthur," I muttered to the empty room. "Hell of a slumber party." It was creepy, sure, but in a fascinating, historical way. I didn't feel afraid. I felt lucky. I had just acquired an extra 900 square feet of usable space. I planned to turn it into a wine cellar, maybe a specialized home theater. I left the heavy blast door open that night to let the room air out. I went upstairs, made dinner, and went to bed feeling smug about my investment. I didn't know then that the door wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep something in. And I had just broken the seal. The next morning, armed with a mug of black coffee and a box of 100-watt bulbs, I went back down. Daylight from the basement windows didn't reach the shelter, so the darkness inside was absolute. Until I found the single pull chain fixture hanging from the center of the ceiling. I screwed in a fresh bulb. The light flickered, then flared to life, casting harsh geometric shadows against the walls. Now that I could actually see, the architect in me started picking apart the room's design. And honestly, it didn't make any sense. A fallout shelter is a machine for survival. You need zones, a chemical toilet, water storage, food prep, air filtration. But this room had none of that. It was a concrete box, 30 feet square, with absolutely no infrastructure for life support. There were just the beds. I walked to the center of the room, standing directly under the light. From this vantage point, the arrangement was even more unsettling. The 12 cots were positioned with mathematical precision, forming a tight circle about 10 feet in diameter. The foot of each bed pointed inward. If 12 people lay in these beds, they would all be staring at each other. Or staring at me, standing right here in the middle. A shiver worked its way down my spine, despite the heavy wool sweater I was wearing. The air down here sat around 50 degrees, damp and heavy. I approached the cot closest to the door, let's call it bed 1. I ran my hand over the blanket. It was coarse, scratchy military wool, dyed a dark olive drab. The sheet underneath was cotton, yellowed slightly with age but pressed smooth. Taut. Whoever had made these beds had done it with obsessive care. Hospital corners. Not a single crease. I took a picture with my phone, the flash illuminating the grim circle of cots, and texted it to my buddy Mark, a contractor in Portland. Check out the murder dungeon in the new place. 12 beds. Thinking of starting a cult. You in? He replied almost instantly. Dude, that's bad vibes. Burn some sage or something. Seriously. I laughed it off, but I didn't spend much more time down there. The acoustics were weird. My footsteps slapped too loudly against the concrete, and there was a subtle, low-frequency hum that I couldn't locate. Probably just the old wiring. I decided the room needed a deep clean before I did anything else. I left the blast door wide open again, hoping to cycle out the stagnant air. Before I went back upstairs, I took one last look at the circle. 12 empty beds, perfectly made. Waiting. It was 11:30 a.m. on a Wednesday. Everything was normal. I shut the basement door at the top of the stairs, locked it out of habit, and went to work in my office. I didn't hear a single sound from below for the rest of the day. I woke up Thursday with a headache. The air in the house felt drier than usual, which was strange for Oregon in October. I shook it off, grabbed a bucket of warm soapy water and a stiff bristled brush, and headed for the basement stairs. My plan was simple. Scrub down the concrete walls of the shelter, strip the old bedding, and maybe drag the frames out so I could paint the floor. But the moment I opened the door at the top of the stairs, I froze. The smell hit me first. Yesterday, the bunker had smelled like 70 years of nothing, dry dust and steel. Today, a wave of warm, humid air rolled up the staircase. It smelled organic, sour, like a locker room that hadn't been aired out, mixed with the copper tang of old pennies. "Hello?" I called out. My voice wavered. I felt foolish immediately. Who would be in my basement? I gripped the handle of the scrub brush like a weapon and descended. The blast door was still open, just as I'd left it. I walked into the shelter, and my bucket slipped from my hand. It hit the concrete with a wet clatter, soapy water splashing across my boots. I didn't move. I couldn't. The beds. When I left them yesterday evening, the olive drab blankets had been pulled taut, tight enough to bounce a quarter off of. Now, 11 of them were destroyed. They weren't torn or shredded. They were depressed. Deep, heavy indentations were sunk into the center of the mattresses, as if massive weights had been resting there for hours. The wool blankets were twisted and matted down into the shape of curled bodies. The pillows on those 11 beds were crushed flat, preserving the outline of heads that had rested there. I stepped closer to the bed at the 3 o'clock position. The impression in the mattress was unmistakable. I could see the curve where a shoulder would have dug in, the hip, the knees drawn up toward the chest. It looked exactly like someone had slept there all night, someone heavy. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, wet rhythm. I spun around, checking the others. Every single cot in the circle bore the same heavy, sleeping imprint, except one. The cot closest to the door, the one I had touched yesterday, was pristine. The blanket was still tight. The pillow was fluffy and centered. I did the math instantly, and my stomach dropped. 11 sleepers. One empty spot. Rats, I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. It has to be raccoons or rats. But I knew I was lying to myself. Rats don't weigh 200 pounds. Rats don't lie perfectly still on their sides, facing the center of a room. And rats definitely don't tuck the sheets back in around their shoulders. I reached out to touch the indentation on the nearest bed. I expected it to be cold. The wool was warm. Not hot, but retaining a distinct, fading heat, like whatever had been lying there had only gotten up a few minutes ago. I backed out of the room slowly, refusing to turn my back on the circle until I was past the blast door. Then I ran. I ran up the stairs, slammed the basement door, and deadbolted it. I spent the next 2 hours pacing my living room, my phone in my hand, dialing and then canceling a call to the police. Tell them what? "Officer, someone slept in my basement beds, but they're gone now and didn't steal anything. I'm a rational man, an architect. I deal in load-bearing walls, structural integrity, and physics. Physics says ghosts don't generate body heat. Physics says intruders don't break into a house just to take a nap and leave without a trace. Moisture, I told myself. It's the moisture. The sudden change in airflow when I opened the seal caused the 70-year-old cotton batting in the mattresses to collapse. The heat, friction, maybe a chemical reaction in the decaying foam. It was weak, and I knew it, but I needed it to be true. By 4 p.m., the sun was still up, and my courage had returned. I couldn't live in a house where I was afraid of my own basement. I needed proof. I needed a control test. I drove to the hardware store and bought a heavy-duty master padlock and a 10-pound bag of white baking flour. Back at the house, I forced myself to go back down. The air in the shelter had cooled, and the sleeping smell had faded back to the scent of old dust. I walked to each of the 11 messy beds and aggressively smoothed them out. I pulled the blankets tight, tucking the corners until my fingers were raw. I karate chopped the pillows back into shape. I made them perfect again, identical to the 12th bed. Then I opened the bag of flour. I dusted the floor. I started from the center of the circle and worked my way out, coating the concrete in a fine snowy layer. If a mouse so much as twitched a whisker down here, I would see the disturbance. I dusted the threshold. I dusted the hallway leading to the blast door. Finally, I stepped out, leaving a trail of my own footprints in the flour. I swung the heavy steel door shut. It slammed with a reassuring finality. I threaded the new padlock through the latch and snapped it closed. I retreated up the stairs, locked the basement door, and put a chair under the handle. There, I said aloud. Science. I poured myself a stiff drink and sat in the living room, waiting for the sun to go down. I felt clever. I felt in control. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with a book, listening. The house was silent. No creaks. No footsteps. Just the wind in the pines outside. At 6 a.m., with the sun just beginning to bleed gray light through the windows, I decided it was time. I grabbed the key to the padlock. If the flour was undisturbed, I was crazy. If there were footprints, I had a squatter. Either option was better than the alternative. I moved the chair, unlocked the basement door, descended the stairs. The blast door was exactly as I had left it. The padlock was secure. I unlocked it. The shackle popped open with a click. I grabbed the iron wheel, turned it, and pulled. The door groaned open. I shone my flashlight onto the floor. My breath caught in my throat. The flour was perfect. An unbroken field of white. My footprints from yesterday were the only marks in the dust. Not a single toe drag. Not a paw print. Nothing had walked across that floor. I raised the beam to the beds. The glass of whiskey I'd poured the night before would have shattered in my hand if I was holding it. The 11 beds were destroyed again. My brain tried to reject what my eyes were seeing. It was a physical sensation, a sharp pressure behind my eyes as I tried to force the image to make sense. The flour was an unbroken white sea. It looked like fresh snow. Not a single speck had been displaced. If 11 someones had walked into this room to lie down, they would have had to hover. And yet, the beds. This wasn't just sleeping anymore. This was thrashing. The olive drab blankets on the 11 cots were twisted into tight, frantic ropes. They were kicked down to the foot of the frames, or pulled up violently over the pillows. The white sheets underneath were stained with sweat, dark, damp patches in the shape of torsos. I stepped inside, carefully placing my boots into the exact footprints I had made the day before. I didn't want to ruin the crime scene. I needed to be sure. I reached the center of the room. The silence was deafening, but it was the temperature that made me gag. Yesterday, it had been 50 degrees. Now, the air was thick, wet, and hot. It felt like stepping into a crowded subway car in the middle of July. It smelled of morning breath, that sour, organic scent of carbon dioxide and saliva multiplied by 11. I held my hand over the third bed. The heat radiating off the mattress hit my palm instantly. It was fever hot. How? I croaked. The word was swallowed by the heavy air. I spun around to look at the 12th bed, the one closest to the door. It was an island of calm in the chaos. The blanket was military tight. The pillow was fluffed and cool. The flour on the floor around it was smooth as glass. It wasn't just that it was empty. It was that it was ready. I looked back at the messy beds. I noticed something I hadn't seen from the doorway. On bed 7, the sheet was clawed. Not torn, but the fabric was stretched thin, with 4 distinct drag marks running parallel down the center, as if someone had dug their fingers in while dreaming. I looked at the padlock in my hand. It was a master lock magnum, solid steel. I had the only key. The hinges were welded, The walls were 12 inches of reinforced concrete. There was no way in. But the heat. The heat proved they had been here. They had been here all night. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I realized then that my control test had failed in the worst possible way. I hadn't proven that no one was down here. I had proven that walls and locks didn't matter to them. I didn't bother locking the blast door this time. I didn't want to touch it. I backed out of the room, my boots sliding slightly in the flour, scrambling to get away from that suffocating heat. As I reached the stairs, I heard a sound. Pop. It came from the room behind me, the sound of a metal joint cooling and contracting, or a bed frame shifting as weight was removed. I didn't look back. I ran upstairs and vomited into the kitchen sink. I stopped going to the basement. I didn't even look at the door. I dragged a heavy oak dresser from the hallway and pushed it in front of the entrance to the stairs. It was a childish, irrational barrier. If they could walk over flour without leaving footprints, a dresser wouldn't stop them. But it made me feel slightly less exposed. The problem was, I couldn't move the rest of the house. My master bedroom is on the ground floor, at the north end of the property. As I lay in bed that Friday night, staring at the ceiling fans spinning lazily in the dark, the architectural blueprints of the house drifted into my mind. I realized with a sick, sinking feeling exactly where I was. The bunker was 30 feet by 30 feet. It was located under the north wing. My bed was directly above the blast shelter. Specifically, my mattress was positioned almost exactly over the center of that concrete circle. I tried to sleep. I squeezed my eyes shut and listened to a podcast on full volume. But by 2 a.m., my earbuds died. The silence that rushed back in was heavy. At 2:14 a.m., I heard it. It started as a low vibration in the floorboards. A rhythmic, dull thrumming. Wah, 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 wah. I sat up, gripping the duvet. My first thought was the furnace, but the furnace was in the attic. I swung my legs out of bed and placed my bare feet on the hardwood floor. The wood was cold, but the vibration traveled up my shins. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the consistent, mindless drone of a machine. It was organic. It was uneven. It was breathing. I got down on my hands and knees, pressing my ear against the polished oak planks. The sound was clearer now. It wasn't just one person. It was a chorus. A deep, wet, synchronized inhaling that sounded like the house itself was struggling for air. Inhale, a rattle of fluid in a throat. Exhale, a long, whistling sigh. I closed my eyes and tried to count. There were distinct layers to the sound. A heavy, snoring bass, a sharper, wheezing tenor. It sounded like a hospital ward for the terminally ill, magnified by the acoustics of the concrete box below me. They were sleeping. Right beneath me. Only 12 inches of wood, insulation, and concrete separated my body from theirs. Then came the other sound. Squeer-runk. The unmistakable sharp groan of a metal cot spring being compressed. Then the slide of stiff fabric rubbing against fabric. Someone down there was rolling over. Squeak. Shuffle. Squeak. Another one turned. Then another. It sounded restless. Agitated. I pulled back from the floor as if it had burned me, scrambling backward until my back hit the wall. I sat there in the dark, knees pulled to my chest, listening to the muffled, rhythmic breathing of 11 things sleeping in my basement. And the worst part? I could hear the silence where the 12th breath should have been. The gap in the rhythm. The empty beat. They were waiting. Saturday morning, I went to Home Depot. I didn't buy a gun. I bought a rigid micro CA 25 digital inspection camera, the kind plumbers use to look inside clogged pipes. It had a 3-foot flexible cable with a waterproof camera head and an LED light at the tip. I wasn't going back into that room, not physically, but I had to know what was happening down there. I remembered seeing a rusted ventilation grill in the back of the pantry closet. Based on the house layout, that duct ran straight down into the shelter's air filtration unit. I cleared out the canned goods and unscrewed the grill. A draft of that same, warm, metallic air drifted up, smelling like wet wool and electricity. I felt my stomach turn, a sudden wave of motion sickness that nearly made me lose my balance. I fed the camera cable down the shaft. The handheld monitor flickered to life. The image was grainy and low-res, illuminated only by the harsh white LED on the camera tip. I watched the galvanized steel walls of the duct slide by. Down. Down. 6 feet. 8 feet. The camera popped out into the open space of the bunker. On the small screen, the room looked like a nightmare found footage tape. The dust motes dancing in the light looked like swarms of insects. I maneuvered the cable, twisting the handle to rotate the camera head. I saw the floor first. The flower was still there, perfectly white, undisturbed. I angled the camera up. There was bed 5. The blanket was mangled, half dragged onto the floor. The mattress was deeply depressed. I panned left. Bed 4. Bed 3. Bed 2. They were all the same, violent messes of twisted fabric. And even through the pixelated screen, I could see the dampness. The pillows looked sodden, dark with sweat. Then I panned toward bed 12. The empty one, the one closest to the door. As the camera lens rotated toward that specific corner of the room, the monitor in my hand hissed. Horizontal bands of static tore across the image. The colors inverted, black becoming white, green becoming magenta. I tapped the screen. "Come on," I muttered. I twisted the cable back toward bed 11. The image cleared instantly. I could see the frayed edge of the wool blanket in perfect detail. I twisted it back to bed 12. ZZZZT. The screen scrambled into a chaotic mess of digital noise. But it wasn't random static. Through the distortion, I could see shapes moving. Not physical shapes, but shadows. Glitches that looked like silhouettes standing around the bed. And then the sound started. The inspection camera has a small microphone. I had the volume on the handheld unit turned up. At first, it was just the hiss of the room tone. But as I held the camera pointed at the glitching 12th bed, the sound began to bleed through the speaker. It wasn't the breathing I'd heard the night before. It was a low, resonant frequency. A thrumming vibration that I felt in my teeth before I heard it in my ears. It sounded like a massive choir humming a single dissonant note, layered over the sound of weeping? No, not weeping. Giggling. A wet, suppressed tittering sound. Like children trying not to laugh at a funeral. My vision swam. The nausea I'd felt earlier slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The walls of the pantry seemed to expand and contract. My nose started to bleed, a sudden, warm drip hitting the screen of the monitor. I yanked the cable back. I pulled it up hand over fist, frantic to get the eye out of that room. As the camera head breached the vent and came back into the pantry, the screen cleared. The sound cut out. The nausea vanished instantly, leaving me trembling on the kitchen floor, clutching a cable covered in gray dust. I played back the recording later on my laptop. The video file was corrupted. From the moment the camera entered the room to the moment I pulled it out, there was nothing but black screen. Except for one frame, right at the end, just before the camera went back into the vent. A single freeze frame of bed 12. The bed wasn't empty in the frame. The flour around it wasn't smooth. There were footprints, hundreds of them. Naked, human footprints, circling the bed in a tight, frantic dance. And on the pillow, there was a single, deep indentation. Sunday night brought the storm. It wasn't just rain, it was a gale coming off the Pacific that shook the gutters and turned the pines into whipping shadows. I was in the kitchen, trying to distract myself by organizing the pantry when the power died. It didn't flicker, it just cut. 1 second I was looking at a can of soup. The next, I was standing in absolute, suffocating darkness. The hum of the refrigerator died, leaving only the roar of the wind outside. I froze, waiting for the backup generator to kick in. It's an automatic system I'd installed the week I moved in. It didn't start. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut a thin, shaky cone through the kitchen. I was heading for the back door to check the breaker panel outside when I heard it. It came from beneath the floorboards. C-L-ang. The sound of a heavy steel latch falling back. Then, the slow, agonizing screech of rusted hinges. Eey're. It was the blast door. I stopped breathing. I stood there in the kitchen, gripping my phone until my knuckles turned white. I had padlocked that door. I had the only key in my pocket. I had barricaded the stairwell with a solid oak dresser, but the sound was unmistakable. The metal-on-metal groan echoed up through the heating vents, reverberating through the silent house. I don't know why I went down. Maybe part of me still hoped it was just the wind pressure, a draft forcing the old latch. Maybe I just needed to see. I walked to the hallway. The heavy oak dresser I had pushed in front of the basement door was gone. Not tipped over, not pushed aside. It was simply gone, as if it had never been there. The door to the basement stairs was wide open. A draft of warm, wet air flowed up from the darkness below. It smelled of ozone and laundry detergent. I descended the stairs, one slow step at a time. My flashlight beam danced erratically on the walls. At the bottom, the blast door stood wide open. The padlock was lying on the concrete floor, still locked. The hardened steel shackle twisted and snapped like a twig. I stepped into the shelter. The heat was unbearable. It hit me like a physical wall, humid, cloying, and smelling of sweat. I swept the light across the circle. The 11 beds were in chaos, as usual. Mattresses depressed, blankets kicked off, sheets soaked. But my light landed on bed 12. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might faint. The old yellowed military sheets were gone. The scratchy olive wool blanket was gone. In their place were my sheets. Navy blue cotton with a subtle geometric white pinstripe. The ones I had bought at Target 3 weeks ago. The ones that were supposed to be on my bed upstairs right now. I saw my duvet, neatly folded at the foot of the cot. My spare pillow, the memory foam one with the gray case, was centered perfectly at the head of the bed. The bed wasn't just made, it was turned down. The corner of the sheet was folded back in a welcoming triangle. The smell of lavender and fresh linen drifted up, cutting through the stench of the humid room. They hadn't just broken out, they had come upstairs while I was in the kitchen. They had walked past me in the dark. They had stripped my bed, and they had prepared a spot for me. I should have turned and ran. My brain was screaming at me to run, to scramble up those stairs and never look back. But my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, rooted to the concrete by a primal lizard brain terror that locked every muscle tight. I was staring at my own pillow, the one I had slept on the night before. The silence in the room was shattered. It wasn't a sudden noise. It was a gradual realization of volume. The sound of breathing I had heard through the floorboards upstairs was a whisper compared to this. Down here, standing at the threshold of the circle, it was a roar. Whoosh. It was the wet, rattling breath of deep sleep, and it was coming from everywhere. I jerked my flashlight beam to the left, toward bed 1. The bed looked empty, but as the beam hit the mattress, I watched the fabric move. The center of the cot sank down slowly, groaning under a heavy, invisible weight. The wool blanket tightened, pulling taut across a form that wasn't there. The pillow compressed, splitting down the middle as if a heavy head had just rolled onto it. I swung the light to bed 2, bed 3, bed 4. They were all moving. The mattresses creaked and dipped. The sheets rustled. The air grew hotter by the second, the temperature climbing rapidly past 90 degrees. It was the radiant heat of living bodies, fevers, sweat, pumping, blood pressed tight into a small room. I could smell them. Not just the stale bunker air anymore, but the distinct sharp reek of unwashed skin and morning breath. "Who are you?" I whispered. My voice was a broken squeak. The breathing didn't stop. If anything, it fell into a tighter rhythm. In, out, in, out. I felt a pressure against my leg. The air displaced, like someone walking past me very closely. I stumbled back, my back hitting the cold steel of the open blast door. The flashlight beam flickered. The battery was new, but the light dimmed to a sickly yellow, barely cutting through the gloom. In the dying light, I looked at bed 12. My bed. The covers on bed 12 lifted. The corner of my navy blue sheet rose up in the air, held by invisible fingers, and peeled back further. The mattress depressed slightly, as if someone was patting the spot, signaling me to sit. Then came the voice. It didn't come from the beds. It came from right beside my ear, a dry, raspy whisper that smelled like copper and old dust. The circle is broken. I whipped my head around, shining the light into the empty corner. Nothing. The whisper came again, from the other side. Closer. Wet lips almost brushing my neck. "We are cold." Then a third voice, deeper, coming from the center of the room. "Sleep." The flashlight died. Total, crushing darkness swallowed me, but the sound remained. The shifting of weight on springs, the wet breathing, and now the sound of movement feet hitting the floor. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. The darkness was heavy, pressing against my eyeballs, filled with the shuffling sounds of 11 invisible things moving around the room. Slap, slap, slap. Bare feet on concrete. They were out of bed. I swiped up on my screen. The flashlight app engaged, casting a harsh, blue-white glare into the suffocating room. I wasn't looking at the beds anymore. In my panic, I had backed up against the wall, just inside the blast door frame. The light hit the concrete inches from my face. There was something there I had never noticed before. It was a clipboard. A heavy, rusted steel clipboard hanging from a hook that had been painted over to blend perfectly with the gray wall. It was nearly invisible, unless you were standing right against it or trapped against it. I don't know why I looked. I should have been running. But the paper clamped onto the board was white. Fresh. It stood out against the grime of the shelter. I angled the light. It was a log sheet, grid lines drawn in black ink. At the top, in precise, capitalized block letters, Cycle 49. Below that, a numbered list, 1 through 12. The first 11 slots were filled with names I didn't recognize. David H., Sarah L., Michael K. Beside each name was a date, ranging back to 1956. And through each of those 11 names, a thick, violent black line had been drawn. Crossed out. Cancelled. My eyes jumped to the bottom of the list. To number 12. My breath hitched in a throat that felt like it was closing up. In the 12th slot, the ink wasn't dry. It glistened in the LED light. It was my name. But it wasn't just my name. It was my handwriting. I stared at the looping at the end of my signature. I have a very specific way of writing. A distinct slant I developed in architecture school. It was unmistakable. I looked at the date next to it. October 14th, the day I closed on the house. I felt the blood drain from my face. I hadn't been down here on the 14th. I hadn't found the door until a week later. I hadn't touched a pen to this paper. But the evidence was right there. I had signed in. We waited. A voice whispered. It came from directly in front of me, inches from my face, but the air remained empty. We waited for the 12th. I looked back at the paper. Underneath my signature, in shaky, scratching letters that looked like they had been carved with a fingernail, was a single instruction. Shift start. Now. The shuffling sound stopped. The room went dead silent. The heat spiked again, blistering, unbearable. I slowly lowered the phone light from the clipboard to the space in front of me. The flour on the floor wasn't white anymore. It was churned up, messy, and standing in a semicircle around me, blocking the exit, were 11 pairs of footprints in the dust. They stopped 2 feet away, toes pointing at me. They weren't just invisible anymore. As I watched, the air above the footprints began to shimmer. Like heat, haze on asphalt. The space was distorting, thickening. I was boxed in, and they were waking up for their shift. The air pressure in the room dropped so sharply my ears popped. The shimmering heat haze above the 11 pairs of footprints wasn't just visual anymore. It was solidifying. They were closing the semicircle. I realized with a jolt of primal terror that they weren't attacking me. They were hurting me. They were pushing me backward, step by step, toward the open, waiting embrace of bed 12. No, I choked out. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just reacted. I lowered my shoulder and charged directly at the gap between the footprints of number 4 and number 5. It should have been empty air. Instead, I hit a wall of resistance that felt like pushing through thick, hot gelatin. It was repulsive, a physical sensation of wetness and electricity that crawled over my skin. I felt resistance, like muscle and bone yielding under my weight, but there was nothing there to see. A sound tore through the room, a collective, shrieking gasp, like 11 people having the wind knocked out of them simultaneously. I stumbled, my boots skidding in the flour, and fell forward into the hallway outside the blast door. My knees slammed against the concrete. The heat in the room behind me spiked. The silence shattered. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy, frantic footsteps. Not walking, running. I scrambled to my feet, spinning around to grab the iron wheel of the blast door. My hands were slick with sweat. I grabbed the edge of the massive steel slab and threw my entire body weight backward. The door swung on its well-oiled hinges. Through the narrowing gap, I saw the flour on the floor of the shelter exploding upward. It looked like invisible tornadoes were tearing across the room, kicking up white clouds as they rushed the door. I saw my navy blue sheets on bed 12 rip apart. The mattress flew into the air, hitting the ceiling with a violent whump, as if thrown by a tantruming giant. The circle! The voices screamed. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a deafening, distorted shriek that sounded like grinding metal. Do not break the circle. I slammed the door shut. I grabbed the wheel and spun it. 1 rotation. 2. The locking bars groaned as they extended into the frame. Boom. The impact shook the fillings in my teeth. The steel door bowed outward, actually bowed under the force of the blow. Dust rained down from the ceiling joists. Boom. Let us out. Boom. It's your turn. I didn't stay to check the seal. I scrambled up the wooden stairs on my hands and feet, slipping, clawing at the steps. I could hear the wheel below me starting to turn back. Squee. They were opening it from the inside. I burst into the hallway, grabbed the heavy oak dresser I had moved earlier, and with a strength I didn't know I possessed, I tipped it over. It crashed down in front of the basement door with a splintering crack. I grabbed my car keys from the bowl. I didn't take a coat. I didn't take my laptop. I ran out into the storm, jumped into my truck, and floored it down the driveway, the tires spraying gravel as I tore away from the house. As I turned onto the main road, I looked in the rearview mirror. The lights in the house were flickering, and in the window of the master bedroom, my bedroom, I saw the curtains move. I am writing this from room 14 at the Stardust Motel in Boise, Idaho. It's been 6 days since I left Oregon. I haven't gone back. I haven't called a moving company. I left my drafting table, my laptop, my clothes, and my entire life in that house. The bank can have it. The state can have it. Hell, they can have it. I thought distance would help. I drove 400 miles without stopping, fueled by adrenaline and terror, until my gas light came on and my hands were shaking too hard to hold the wheel. I thought if I crossed state lines, the contract would be void, but I was wrong. The first night in the motel, I passed out from exhaustion. I didn't dream, but I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. The room was freezing. The heater was off, but I could see my breath in the air. And in the silence of that cheap motel room, I heard it. Shh. Faint. Distant. Like it was coming from inside the walls or from under the floorboards. The sound of 11 people sleeping in unison. I checked the mirror in the bathroom. There was a bruise on my shoulder. 4 distinct finger marks, purple and yellow, pressed deep into the skin. The exact spot where I felt the resistance when I broke through the circle. I realized then that I didn't escape. I signed the log. My name is on the list. I am employee number 12, and I walked off the job during my shift. They aren't stuck in the basement anymore. They are tethered to me. I can't sleep alone. I tried sleeping in my car at a rest stop, but the moment I drifted off, the car filled with the smell of wet wool and ozone. So now, I stay in hostels. I book beds in shared dorms. It's the only way I can close my eyes without screaming. I need the noise of real people, but it's getting worse. Last night, I was in a room with 5 other travelers to drown out the phantom sounds in my head. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Plus me makes 6. Safe. But as I drifted off, I heard a new sound joining the chorus. A wet, rattling wheeze from the empty top bunk in the corner. Then another from the floor. Then another. I counted again. 6 real breaths. 11 phantom ones. I am the 12th. If you are ever looking for a house in rural Oregon, and you find a deal that seems too good to be true, check the basement. If you see a circle of beds, turn around. Don't touch them. Don't count them. And for God's sake, if you wake up in the middle of the night and hear breathing that doesn't belong to you, don't close your eyes again. They are waiting for the circle to be complete. And I think they're tired of waiting for me to come back. I think they're coming to collect.